One of the most common things I hear when talking to people about their journey with chronic illness is how they became sick overnight. Like someone just flipped a switch in their body and then boom, suddenly they're navigating a minefield of debilitating symptoms. And it can be frustrating and overwhelming and terrifying. But the most fascinating thing I've learned from those who have recovered is that the trigger for that overnight switch was actually just the final straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, rather than being the beginning of the end. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Raelan Agle, and here we dive into recovery stories and uncover wisdom from those who've healed from chronic illnesses like long COVID, ME/CFS, Lyme disease, and more. With guests from all across the globe, we are peeling back the layers to understand what's really behind these conditions and what can actually help. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you to my guest, Nate Singer, originally from California, but now lives in and is joining us from Sayulita, Mexico. Diagnosed with chronic fatigue, a bacterial infection, and chronic Lyme, Nate was told by multiple doctors that he'd likely end up in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. But he was determined to rewrite that script. He searched high and low for answers, from the most cutting edge Western technologies to energy work and psychedelics, until he slowly began shedding symptoms one by one. And now he's here with us to share what helped him reclaim his joyful and fulfilling life. You are going to absolutely love Nate. He is an amazing person and a wealth of insight and information. So let's dive in. Nate, amazing to have you here. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's really nice to meet you. I appreciate it.
Oh, wow. So I only know the high level details of your story and looking at what you've been through throughout your life on your health journey. And oh my goodness. So I am dying to get into this. I am so curious to hear how this has all gone for you. So I don't know where you want to start, but take us
Yeah.
back. Tell us a bit about it.
I think I'll probably start when this stretch right before I got really sick, um, where I had a business designing fancy aquariums for people in your neck of the woods, so in Walnut Creek and Marin County in San Francisco. And, I was playing sports all the time and really active. And I remember going for a run through my little neighborhood, and I was with my dog and I was running. I got like, I don't know, 10 minutes in, and it just felt like somebody was like powering down the batteries. I was like, that's weird. Like, I haven't even run very far yet. And so I kind of went back home and was like, oh, whatever, I'll feel better tomorrow. And then I didn't feel better tomorrow. I just stayed really tired, and I had a couple of days off. And then I went the next week and I had this client. And so I was carrying pretty heavy things, and they had this really tall staircase. And I can remember taking these heavy things out of my truck and looking up the staircase and just having this really deep sense that there was no way I was making it up the staircase, and just being like, what do I do? I can't go do my work, I guess. So I put my stuff back in my truck and drove home and got in bed, and was like in there for about a week. And I was like, I just don't understand what's happening. I'm just not getting any energy. And so, it was like not super alarming, but it was strange. It just felt like having the flu without having the flu or something like that. And I kept expecting, like waking up each morning, expecting to feel normal. And it just kept not happening. And as things progressed, I didn't, I'm like a 25-year-old man. We don't go to the doctor. So I didn't, I didn't go to the doctor. And, it took like a good 6 weeks of kind of getting progressively worse, and just feeling like I was a pretty happy-go-lucky person, and look back to that about what was happening in retrospect, because I think I was pretty fully dissociated my entire life at that point, but everything was pleasant. And so I just, like, things just kept stopping working one by one. And I would start to have like memory problems and neurological problems. And I went to doctors a couple times and they were like, we don't know what's wrong. Like, just rest and you'll get better. And that kept not happening. And then round about the 5th month of this, I was getting really scared. And so, I'm going to doctors being more like, hey, something's really wrong. And, as I'm sure most people watching this have had the experience how the doctors were like, just go exercise. And I was like, listen, I'd played hockey my whole life. And that was one of my, like, pretty much my favorite thing to do. And I couldn't do it. And so I was like, listen, man, I want to go exercise. Like, don't tell me to go take a run and I'll feel better. It doesn't, like, try that. It doesn't work. And then round about, this 5th or 6th month, I woke up one morning and there was a stretch of like the size of a ruler, like 12 inches long on my forearm. And it just felt like my skin was on fire. And I was looking at it and there was no redness. There was no nothing. It was like, this is really weird. And progressively each morning that I woke up, it was bigger and bigger and bigger. And so over the course of 2-3 weeks, it basically just spread to my entire body, at which point I couldn't sleep anymore. And I started struggling to walk, and I couldn't remember I couldn't read anymore. I was like stuck at home, and I love to read, and I couldn't read. I would like read a page, and like my comprehension was still fine, but my memory was bad. And so I would like read a page and then I would completely forget everything I just read and have to start again. And unfortunately, this was in the days before like TiVo, dating it a little bit here. So I was just like watching daytime TV, laying on the couch. Just like things just kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And I started getting these really strange neurological symptoms, like I would get kind of like object dyslexia, where I would, if I had an object in one hand and the other, I would just get them mixed up. So like once I really injured myself by having a headphone in one hand and my key in the other hand, and I just jabbed the key into my ear because my brain was like mixed up the objects in the two hands. And I went to, like, now when I would go to doctors, they could tell that something was wrong and they wouldn't necessarily know what was wrong. I had a couple doctors who told me I almost certainly had MS and would probably be stuck in a wheelchair, because I was like, I would walk for a little bit and then I would just like have to stop, or I'd fall over, or like my feet basically weren't listening to my brain. And so, I was kind of reckoning with this idea that I might just be in a wheelchair the rest of my life. And they were, sending me to MRIs to try to find the lesions in the brain or spine that you get with MS. And then I went and saw this doctor who I think was during the stretch, the first really good one who I saw. And he came in and he said, all right, I know this might seem strange, but what I want you to do is to count backwards from 10. And while you do that, to clap your hands like this. And so I went, like, sure, I can still do that at least. And I went like this, and I went 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. And I'm looking at my hand and I'm telling it to turn over and it won't turn over. And I had never like felt a sense of terror like that before. And I'm a person who's done a lot of dumb stuff in my life. Like, I put myself in pretty dangerous situations regularly, but I had never been that scared. And I was like, my life is over if even my hands won't listen to what I want them to do anymore. And so he said, like, clearly there's something really wrong. We're going to find out what it is. And so they started testing me for everything under the sun. I remember I had to like go in once a week and just bring like a giant jug of pee to the doctor, which was a very strange experience. And eventually what he found was that I had the bacteria that causes typhoid fever and a whole bunch of antibodies for that. And it was interesting because what I realized is also that about a year and a half before I got really sick, I'd been bitten by a tick and I got the bullseye rash that everybody talks about. And I like felt like I had the flu for a day or two and then I was fine. And so like, I was like, I wonder, maybe you should test me for Lyme disease. And I think the tests have gotten better since then. They were pretty unreliable. So he tested me once and it came back negative. And he's like, well, I guess it must be the bacteria. So they gave me, this was about month 11 or 12. And they gave me a ton of antibiotics. And pretty quickly, some of the neurological symptoms went away. Like my memory started to come back and I could control my body, but also I just had crippling fatigue and pain. And so I would, it felt like a huge reprieve. I remember when he called me and kind of told me the news, I remember doing like a full, like, I just won the Olympics thing where I was like, you mean I'm not going to be stuck in a wheelchair the rest of my life? And he's like, no, I don't think so. I was like, "Ooh, this is the best news ever. You know, I'm going to send this guy a gift basket for the rest of my life. Um, which is funny to think about, given that my quality of life wasn't good at that point, you know?
Yeah.
It was certainly a better option than what I thought was happening. But it started a real journey for years to try to figure out. And this was, at this point, 18 years ago. And so we were kind of in the dark ages still with these conditions, where I remember asking the doctor after I was like, hey, so like, I'm just going to get better. They're like, yeah, you'll recover fine. And I was like, do I need to change what I eat? Do I need to change anything? And they're like, nah, everything's fine. And so, yeah, I just kind of muddled along, and I would have stretches where I would feel like I would have extreme pain all the time, but I was getting back to playing sports. So I would, like, kind of at the start, I would go play a hockey game and then be stuck in bed for a week and be like, well, yeah, that was worth it. And then I would, take myself to the gym and start to lift weights again and get stronger, and then crash. And it would just, it just felt like this cycle where as soon as I would really exert myself, I would just kind of crash and burn. And that happened for a while, like years. But I was, yeah. And then I think where things really turned was so one of the things that had happened during the stretch where my business was doing well, but I had one of my brothers really loved to play poker, and he kept inviting me, and I kept not going. I was like, I don't like gambling, whatever. And finally one time I went, and I was like, oh, this all makes sense to me. And so I had really enjoyed poker and was making like a pretty decent amount of money outside of my work, just playing poker for fun. And then being really sick and not being able to leave the house. Poker on the internet was a thing at this point. Still is a thing, but in a different way. And so, like, I realized once I got better, I still had way too much pain and fatigue to go back to. I'd already given my business to one of my brothers, and I was like, what if I just try to play poker and make money that way? And it turns out it worked. And I just kind of made enough money to make a decent living playing poker.
Wow.
Yeah, which was really convenient when you can't really walk around much,
Yeah.
to be able to sit in your house and play poker on the internet and make a living. And so what happened then was a couple years after after that acute illness stretch, the US made playing poker on the internet illegal. And so I was left with this choice of like, do I want to start another business, or do I want to just leave the country and go somewhere where playing poker on the internet is legal? And so I chose option B, and I ended up in Panama because they had pretty decent infrastructure and they used the US dollar, and it seemed easy. And I moved to this beautiful little mountain town on the like Panama, Costa Rica border. And it was the first time I ever lived in a small town. And I realized like very quickly that something I'd been missing my whole life was having like a supportive, warm community. And there was like this close-knit group of friends that I made pretty quickly, where we would cook together and eat together and go to yoga class together, which I'd never done before. And at this point, like I legitimately like couldn't even touch my ankles, because my body was from the illness like so stiff and painful that like even getting a massage just hurt so much. But one of the things that started happening is I realized that if I love to cook, so if people came over and there were like 15 people and we all cooked together and then sat together and ate really slowly and cleaned together and then like sat around and played a game afterwards, after they left, I would be like, hey, wait a second, my body doesn't hurt. And so that really, I think that's where the kind of path to getting better really started, because it was as though, like, did you ever eat top ramen when you were a kid?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is like, it's delicious, but it felt kind of like I'd been eating top ramen my whole life and being like, well, this is ramen. And then somebody brought me to like a proper Japanese ramen shop. I was like, wait a second.
Oh, yeah.
This is a thing? Like, and just, it felt like being a different person. And so that really, really started making an impact. And then once I got a kind of a breath away from the pain, I think I realized like, if I have no pain for a minute, does that mean it's possible to just not have it at all. And so there's been a very winding road between then and now to get out of that. But it was the first moment where I kind of went from thinking this is just life and being happy with that, going from being like thinking I was never going to get to play sports again to being able to play sports, even if sometimes I would be exhausted and not get out of bed for a month, being like, that's worth it. This is way better than what I thought I was getting. To just being like, hey, wait, maybe I just don't have to deal with this at all.
Yeah. It's really interesting that was one of your turning points to starting to understand this.
Mm.
And I remember on my own journey, right before I got CFS, I craved community so badly. Yeah. And I would watch the TV show Friends and I would think, like, what fiction is this? Like, no one gets to see people all the time and just like have connection and laughs and fun and meals.
Yeah.
Like you're just on the hamster wheel. You work, you sleep, you're alone, you just go through all the motions and then, we do become unwell and no doctor's like, well, tell me about your sense of community. Mm. Like, it doesn't even occur to us. Yeah. And initially, like if someone's watching this video or listening to this for the first time, you're like, this isn't what I want to hear. I'm very sick and making friends is not going to be a part of, it's not what I need. Yeah. And of course, that's for most of us, not all that we need, but.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, so to skip what we can speak back, but I think there's an interesting piece here, which is that it was about 6 years ago now where for the first time, I was listening to an interview with Stephen Porges, the creator of polyvagal theory. And I can remember the exact place that I was because I heard him talk for like 30 minutes and I stopped my car and I just sat there for like 10 minutes as my mind exploded because I was like, this person understands more about the human experience than anybody I've ever heard speak. And so much of what he was talking about was explaining in a biological way why I had the experience that I did of just not ever feeling like I was in a safe environment. I realized I had not felt safe my entire life. And it's so interesting. Like, I'm not a big photos guy, but if I look back at any of the photos that do exist of me when I was like 12 or 15 or 18 or 21, I have a happy expression on my face, but my hands are balled into fists. My body is terrified. And I think that's a really common experience for people who end up with conditions like this. Is like hypervigilance is almost always part of the equation. And hypervigilance is only necessary if you don't feel like your environment is safe.
Yeah. It's one of the themes I've noticed doing these interviews over the years is that at first we started talking about like, oh, I got the tick bite or the virus and that set it off. And then we're like, oh no, I understand it better. I'm going to go back a few months. And now I understand because there's a few things going on. And as the years have passed, now people are saying like, I'm looking back to childhood and I see where this started. Mm-hmm. So it's, our understanding of it, it's fascinating to watch it just even evolve over the last five years. Yeah. And for myself as well, I look back, I'm like, oh my goodness, I was high anxiety. I grew up with a mother with CFS. Like our whole family was stuck in fight or flight. Like it was just stress and chaos and uncertainty all of the time.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think, if you're like born with a sensitive system and then your environment doesn't feel safe. And then I think one of the reasons why the prevalence of these conditions has exploded is because our environment has less and less and less of these cues of community and safety than it's ever had before. Which is kind of wild when you think that this might be the safest time to exist as a human in all, right?
Oh my goodness, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's like everybody's more terrified on a deep primal level.
Yeah.
Because like our machinery doesn't match our environment.
Yeah, and we're aware of every war and every conflict, and we've got Reddit and traffic and email and news notifications, and I think we're simultaneously the smartest species and the dumbest species. It's like there's no other species that struggles to figure out how to live like we do.
Yeah, it's incredibly fascinating. I had this really interesting experience. So I live in Mexico. And I live in a place where hurricanes hit pretty much every year. And so the town where I live tends to organize hurricane relief for some of the surrounding areas because we're like in this weird little pocket where the most intense part of the hurricanes tend to pass us by. We've gotten nailed pretty bad a couple times, but like not devastated.
Mm.
And a lot of the communities around here are pretty poor and get devastated. And so one time I had been back home visiting, and so I'd been in San Francisco, and then came back here, and like a week later we went to do some hurricane relief stuff. And I went to this little town that's like 9 houses up in the mountains, and they have a church and a corner store and one lady who just cooks food for people in her house. And there's no electricity. And the hurricane hit it so hard. It was like, did you ever watch The Never-Ending Story?
Yes, but it's been a while.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
There's this image that I always have in my head of when the nothing rolls through and what the ground looks like after the nothing. Is just there's nothing left. It's just kind of like raised earth. And driving up the mountain to this place, that's what it's like. Every tree had been knocked flat and all the leaves stripped. Like there were like 200-mile-an-hour winds. It was wild. And so one of the things that had happened is it tore the roofs off all the houses. And so I went there, and it was the strangest experience because I had just come from one of the most affluent places in the entire world, and everybody was freaked out. And then into this place where people had very little, and everything they did have it just destroyed. And they were pretty chill. And I was like, the contrast was so sharp that I was like, what is going on here? But I think so much of what's happening is like our machinery is hundreds of millions of years old. Like the basic architecture of it, it's not built for like what happens when you send someone a text and they don't send you one back for 10 hours, but they read it, you know? And I think on some very, very deep level, our systems are freaked out, you know? I was all the time. And so I think that the reason that my pain went away when I was surrounded by these people where I actually felt like I was being like looked after and just like, you know, kind of unconditional warmth and love, is that it was the first time that part of me that was terrified was like, hey, maybe I can actually take a break.
Yeah. I was laughing because I had this vision of, you know, earlier humans talking to one of us now saying, I'm sorry, you're panicked because you're not getting a text back. You're like, but there's no saber-toothed tiger. Just to confirm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you're fine. We just,
get it together.
Oh, I feel like,
Yeah.
But yeah, no, we're triggered all day long, and it's just we get on high alert. It's like if I take my eye off one of these 8 balls I have in the air at any given time, my whole life's going to fall apart, and it's just go, go, go. And okay, so I'm very curious to hear what happened. So you've had this, you know, aha moment about community and cooking dinner with friends making you feel okay. So where do you go from there? You're like, okay, I'm onto something, but now what?
I'm onto something, and I feel like it was kind of like when you're like in a big wave and you're getting tumbled, and you come up for a breath of air. And it like gave me a moment to kind of reflect and be clear. And I was like, okay, I need to like really, like, I just threw everything at the wall. And there was some physical stuff that happened. Like there was a cloud forest above where I lived, and there was this waterfall that was there that was ice cold. And it was so pretty. And the first time I went, I was having like a day where I really hurt a lot. And I jumped in this waterfall that was freezing cold. And I got out and I walked back down the hike down, and I realized again, my pain was gone. And so I was like, hey, wait a second. Like, it seems like getting in there, even though it took some work to get to and it really sucked while I was in there, my body seemed to really like it. And so I tattooed it onto my body in a not particularly beautiful way, but just as a reminder, so that like, if I had a day where I really hurt, when I got in the shower in the morning, I would see the tattoo and be like, hey, dummy, go get in the cold water. Like treating my kind of subconscious like an unruly puppy is like a common theme through the recovery journey for me. And so that was really, really helpful. And then I think just having a window of no pain made me start approaching my life like a scientist would. And I was like, all right, what are the stimulus that are happening on days where the pain's high? What are the stimulus that's happening on the day where the pain is low? And I did this thing where I was like, okay, well, my subconscious in so many ways is real dumb. And so what if on days where I have no pain, I listen to the same piece of music on a cat? So I did that for about a month. And then I was like, all right, cool. Now every time I feel it, I get this rush of like happiness. And so if I woke up on a day where the pain was really high, I would play this piece of music and my body would just get confused. It would be like, hey, this thing means you have no pain, but we feel pain. And then it would just get mixed up. and the pain level would drop.
Wow. I have never heard anyone share that specific strategy. That is brilliant. I love
Thanks. It worked. I was kind of shocked that it worked, to be honest. I was like, I think it might work. But when it did, I was like, whoa, this is great. And so with each step of the pain level dropping, it gave me more space and more, like, as we all know, when your pain levels are high, it's hard to think clearly, you know? And so I felt like I had more energy to apply some strategies to this. And also now reflecting back, it's really weird that I intuitively started doing internal family systems. But I remember having a day where the pain was really high and just wouldn't go away. And no matter how much I was fighting it, it wouldn't leave. And so I was like, clearly fighting it doesn't work. So why not try something else? And so what I did is I laid back in my bed and I imagined myself in like a comfy, safe place. So I imagined myself in like a log cabin up in the mountains, with like a beautiful meadow all around. It looked kind of like your shirt, wildflowers everywhere. and I imagined the pain as like this angry red ball of mist, basically, and like pounding on the door of the house. And then instead of screaming and telling it to screw off like I always did, was like, what happens if I just like open the door and invite it in and make it a cup of tea?
Ooh, again, I like this.
Yeah. And again, like it makes you sound like a little bit of a crazy person, but being like, just the visualization and feeling of like being like, don't stay away, come in, like, tell me your story, made a huge difference. And like that one day, even on the days where the pain would be high, the level of pain would be lower than the peak of it had been. And so I think also another thing that was happening was that with each time I was able to make a dent in this, my faith in the idea of living a life without pain grew and grew and grew. And I think that's such an important part of it, is actually having a hope that you can get better, you know?
I really love that. And it's a different way of looking at things. I'm just thinking, I've got this free 5-day brain training course that I'll cheekily plug right here, but link in the video description. I'm part of the job. We talk about it in there, like interviewing your symptoms instead of running from them or being afraid of them. Think of them as having a message. So like sit down, picture that you're on a YouTube channel with them or a talk show, and you just sit down and like with curiosity, like, hey, what's up? Like, why are you here? What do you want to tell me? Hey, what's going on? And people have told me, like, it feels a bit silly. Like, oh my goodness, am I going to do this silly interview exercise? But people time and time again are like, wow, it answered. Like, I learned stuff. Like, I just gave it space and I heard answers in some form, which is, it goes against the grain of what we want to do. Protect ourselves, run from it, fight it. No.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that like so much of what I've learned, and having talked, like living in places like the places I've lived, tends to attract people who have similar health problems, where just like, I can't handle, like, I got to try something else. I can't handle this. So I get to talk to a lot of people. And that's one of the really common themes for people who get better, is that they realize that the fear is fuel for the pain and the fatigue. And it's kind of like we're standing next to a fire and getting burnt by it and being like, why am I getting burnt by this? And you look down at your left hand and it's just chucking more logs on the fire. Yeah. Which, I don't mean to sound victim blaming. It's not like, I don't think any of this is our fault, but it's just like a natural cycle that happens. It's just like fear is fuel for the pain and pain is fuel for the fear. And it just snowball.
I think that's the aha moment for most of the people I talk to. Fuel was the trigger, or fear was the trigger, and fear is the fuel. And it's this unfortunate downward spiral that can get you bedbound, because the symptoms get worse, and then you start to really panic, like, my body's broken, am I dying? Am I going to be like this for the rest of my life? And then you feel worse, and then you just get stuck in this fear, symptom response.
Yeah, which is really interesting to fast forward a bit. I like live in the tropics, which for people who have autoimmune issues like Lyme disease, is not usually recommended, because it's full of pathogens everywhere and mold and, dengue fever, and it's not a particularly clean environment and so many things. And so I've gotten sick with some pretty serious stuff since then. And it's really interesting, because earlier on, what would happen is I would get sick and a ton of the old symptoms would come back. right? Because I think my brain just had that neural pathway that was like, we're being attacked by something. Here's this part of your arm that's going to feel like it's on fire again. And it went, the first time that happened, I was really scared. I was like, oh no, is this whole cycle going to repeat itself? And then it didn't. It just like, it was there and then gone. And then that gave me more faith. And then like with some more serious illnesses, like the first time I got COVID, like I got really sick for 10 days, but I was fine afterwards. But the second time I got it, I was like, it was rough for about 2-3 months. But it was really interesting to have basically a similar experience, and so many people getting long COVID now that, shocker, looks exactly like CFS in so many ways, and get the same kind of thing happen to me, but have the framework for how to get better and the faith that I will. And it was such a different experience. Like there was no existential horror. I was like, I don't know how long it's going to take, but I know I'm going to get back to feeling really good.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of new people here. I'm just thinking of new people joining the channel and watching. So if you're new to this way of thinking, I get that this might all sound a little bit insane. Totally. And I can link a video where I walk through how your brain, your autonomic nervous system, your limbic system, your amygdala, how symptoms are created, because that's foundational, fundamental for the vast majority of people with these conditions to understand for recovery, because it's understanding that symptoms are created in response to fear, to threat assessment. So this is the focus on fear. To the people who have been here for a long time, you're like, yes, we know this. We can explain it in our sleep. It's crazy. Our community is becoming some of the most well-informed people on the planet.
Yeah. I was excited to come here is because I think there are people struggle to have this conversation because they will say, well, if you're saying it's all about fear, that means it's all in my head. And I'm like, no, that's not what it means. All of these things are real. All the symptoms are real. They are like real physical symptoms. It's just that the way that we think about our mind-body connection, or the way that largely Western medicine does, and seems like things might be shifting, thankfully, is that things are either in your head or in your body, not as the human organism as one unified whole, and I
really love, I'm sure you're aware of Alan Gordon. He runs the Pain Psychology Center here in California. And, he says that the number one question he gets from people, like, does this mean these symptoms aren't real? Does it mean they're all in my head? And I love his response is just like, do you feel them?
Yeah.
Like, yes. He's like, then they are real. And he has a real life example that I love of a guy who, you may have heard this, who was working on a construction site and he stepped on a giant nail. It went straight through his boot and he's screaming in pain. They take him to the hospital. Like he's just losing his mind. It hurts so badly. They removed the boot. There was no damage. It went between his toes. And as soon as he realizes this, the pain goes away. So does that mean the pain wasn't there?
Yeah.
That he didn't experience it, that it wasn't real? It was just as real. And it's such a powerful example because it helps us see how our brain and nervous system, they create these symptoms, whether it's in response to an actual threat or a misinterpreted threat. It's all coming from that. So it's not in your head. It might be in your brain a bit, but it's
his book actually did the training with the Alan Gordon and
oh my goodness, okay. So
processing therapy is like, I feel like so good at explaining a lot of this stuff, and it's great because I actually had a really clean example of this happen to me, where I love to go fishing and fish out of a kayak a lot of the time. And there was one day where I like went through the work of bringing all my kayak and all of the fishing stuff down to the water, and the surf report was wrong, and the waves were very big and not flat calm like it was supposed to be. But I could see that there were fish behind the waves, and as previously referenced, I'm a bit of an idiot, and so I was like, I'm sure it'll be fine. And so I like get in my kayak, I've got my fishing rods, my cooler on the back and the whole thing, and I get hit by a really big wave and the kayak gets knocked sideways. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to leave the kayak out there, get to shore, and then organize myself and do that. And I get like halfway to shore, another big wave comes, hits the kayak and sucks it out to sea. And as it sucks it out to sea, all of a sudden I'm just in the air and I don't know what's happening. And then I like get pulled underwater and is, really scary as I'm just like completely surprised and disoriented. And then I like get a breath of air, try to get back to the shore, same thing happens. And I, after the second time while I was underwater, I was like, something, I'm not understanding something about what's happening right now. And what I realized is that as my kayak flipped, one of my fishing rods had gone into the sand, snapped in half, and the hook from my fishing lure had ended up in my foot. And and so every time the kayak would get sucked out to sea, I would basically get tripwired by this hook in my foot. And so I like managed to gnaw my way through the fishing line, get to shore, and there was no pain at any point in this up to this point in the story, um, because I was drowning, and my brain was like, "Hey, you're drowning. We need to deal with that problem. So like any other problem is not something we're going to deal with right now." And then as soon as I got safe and on the shore and looked down and there was a very gruesome wound in my foot where I had been like yanked into the air by a fishing hook, all of a sudden now my body started hurting, right? And so your brain is just prioritizing like the signals from my foot aren't what is controlling my experience of pain, you know? It was just yeah, it was like nice to have as obvious an example of that in my own life of just like,
Oh my goodness.
my brain is making things.
So getting to where you are now, what exactly did that look like? What else was involved in this process of getting back?
Yeah. So yeah, throwing everything at the wall. One, I think the cornerstone practice that helped me the most, because meditation in general actually didn't help me very much. I would kind of do it, and I think as I mentioned before, like being a person who's prone to dissociation, actually, I think meditation in a lot of ways was counterproductive for me because I would just dissociate and think that I was meditating. But somebody recommended that I go do this practice called tension release exercises. I think back then they called it tension or trauma release exercises, and then it changed at some point. But they were describing it to me, and they're like, well, you like lay on the ground, and then we do a set of exercises, and then your body just kind of starts shaking on its own. And I was like, well, that sounds like nonsense, but why not? And so I went to a practitioner of this, and the first time it happened, my body barely moved, but some deep wise part of me was like something good is happening. And so I went and saw them like 3 times, and the second time my body started moving more, and the third time my body started moving more, and it looked kind of like when you see an animal just shake itself off, other mammals, like a dog or whatever. And I went to a massage therapist who I'd been going to for a while, and he'd been seeing me for a couple of years, and it was just the massages were so painful. I would do this thing where I never used to smoke weed before I got sick, and I mostly did it, and I don't really much anymore now. But I would have to drive to the massage therapist and get so high I couldn't even see straight to get a massage because it hurt so much. But she would dig in, and then after I had done this shaking exercise a few times, she had been away, and she came back and she put her hands on me, and after like 2 seconds, she was like, "What have you been doing?" And I was like, "Nothing. I didn't connect the things." But what had happened was my muscles and my fascia had like there was so much less tension in them. She could actually get her hands in there, and I found it really easy to do, which was cool. And I like that. I think is the one constant that's been there for me. Is I've done that basically every single day for 13 years now.
Wow.
And it takes no work for me to do. It's kind of like weird and pleasant and cool. And I work at a retreat center where we do kind of a nervous system centered program. And so I do workshops that get 20 people in a room all doing this together. And it's a really, like, for a lot of people, a really powerful experience. And that one is kind of the main practice that helped me along the most. But all that stuff helped to like get rid of the symptoms. But I think really unraveling the root causes of this stuff. So just unraveling my own fear response. And that's what really changed my day-to-day experience of just being kind of annoyingly happy all the time. Is like, understanding my fear response and realizing that like saying no to people or like just saying what was happening inside of me was something that was causing a fear response. And I think that's super common for people with these conditions, is that they're just not good at saying no. And so, I can remember back to like after I'd gotten a little bit like, after the acute stage of illness, but when I still had a lot of pain and fatigue, if I was dating somebody and it kind of felt like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be dating anymore, I would get really sick. I would get really sick, and I would be like, well, I can't keep dating this person because I'm really sick. And I think what was happening there is that part of me that controls the sickness was swooping in and being like, you don't want to be in this, but you can't, you're not going to hurt this person's feelings. And so taking a kind of bullshit way out, to put it bluntly, and just recognizing like, oh, I need to, like after that happened like 3 times, I was like, I need to figure my shit out before I date anybody else, because this is not a fair thing to do to another person, and just like seeing the same pattern. So yeah, like really, really just in a very like intentional way being like, what are all the things in the world that make me have a fear response? And then recognizing that we have all these amazing new tools to undo those things, you know, and like shit, like really, really make it so that I can not contract into myself around things that are challenging, and yeah, just create a sense of ease in my own experience. And I think there's lots of cool ways to do that. Like the internal family systems, I think is so beautiful for doing that. And then nervous system work in general, like really understanding what the fear response is and how it shows up in your body. Mm-hmm. You know, like so much of it is all just, I was all in my head for the first ever until I was like 30. And then now I mostly don't listen to what's happening in there. I'm just like, well, what did my body say?
Oh, I love that. And for people watching and listening, Nate has a really great website that I know you have a lot of resources and information on tension and trauma release and different things. So I'll make sure that's linked in the description. So definitely check that out if you're looking to learn more. So you've covered so much here. So do you feel that this is the main key components that got you to where you are, or was there any other important puzzle pieces that you'd want people to know about, either that did or didn't work, or just insights that really helped you along your way?
Yeah, just to briefly touch on the psychedelics piece, because I think that's a hot topic right now for a lot of people. Really helped me in a lot of ways. But I think people talk about it either like it's a bad idea or a good idea, and don't, like the first time I drank ayahuasca, for example, I got into like, I didn't go into it with any kind of real thoughtfulness. I got the like document that they send you about how to prepare, and I was like, well, this sounds crazy. I'm not going to listen to any of this. And then showed up in a room where everybody was wearing white, and I was like, did I join a cult? You know, everybody's like writing down a page full, like an entire notebook full of intentions, and the guy's like, make sure to set an intention. I'm just like, I don't, what, this is all silly. Right. Then I drank it and flopped around like a fish that had been dropped on the shore of a lake for 4 hours, and miraculously felt way better afterwards, and felt like it kind of exploded a lot of my ideas about how the world worked, for sure. But also that's such a like high variance way of doing things. Like it goes so bad for so many people. Yeah. And so, but they can really help with this idea of making friends with yourself, you know, that I mentioned earlier, like the idea of inviting the pain in instead of telling it to go away. That in a lot of ways, psychedelics bring down the walls between the parts of ourselves that have become fractured. But also there's more and more people who are out there doing it in a not very thoughtful or kind of intentional way as practitioners even, or like somebody who has, you know, chronic fatigue syndrome is like, I've heard ayahuasca can be good. And then they just like go to a random place where there's 50 people and 3 practitioners and just feel like disoriented and alone and not supported. Yeah, like really, really, really making sure that you get good recommendations from people and are able to sit with the person running it first and talk to them and just make sure that being in their presence feels good. Yeah, to just like, yeah, just be careful and thoughtful, but also open-minded, I suppose.
I love that. That's fascinating. I've never done anything like it, but I've talked to a few people who have. I'll link at the end of this video. I interviewed an amazing woman named Sophie who did KAMBO, I think, which is in the same family. And she had been severely unwell for more than 20 years, severe pain, chronic fatigue. And she did 3 sessions of this, again, in a controlled environment with someone she trusted, 100%. Fully fine after that. It was, you know, her full answer. So not going to be for everyone, not saying that it is, but I'll link it if people are interested in learning.
At first glance sounds like a completely crazy thing to do.
Yeah, it's like frog poison, right? It's
not even psychedelic, so you don't get the...
she's just violently ill, I think.
The cliff notes on it is like, basically if you imagine like having like 6 hours of terrible food poisoning condensed.
Nobody's going to click on this video that I'm linking. They're like, that sounds like a nightmare.
It made like, that's another one that made a huge, like really move the needle for me, but is also like getting people to do that one. And then you like go on Reddit and it's all, you know, people who are horror stories, which I think is hard with stuff like that, because the people that have amazing experiences are less inclined to share than people who are just like, oh no, that was crazy.
Yeah, actually, and that's not even me. I bet you lots of people are clicking on it because we are all so desperate. We're like, you know, I remember one woman saying, like, you'll eat eyeballs. You'll do anything anyone tells you to do. If it helps someone, you're like, I'll try it.
100%.
Well, this has been absolutely amazing, Nate. I've been on the edge of my seat. There have been so many insights from your interview where I've been like, I have to remember this. I have to remember that. Just so many great things that I'm going to have to go back and watch this again. So I have no doubt that many people really appreciate everything that you shared. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time and for walking us through all of this.
Thank you. I think like I can't say enough good things about, you know, how much giving people hope and resources in this world where like getting these kind of conditions just is alienating and isolating and frustrating and expensive. And, you know, being able to give people the hope and the resources for free is like a really, really impressive thing to be doing. So I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, I love doing it. I say there's never a great time to get a condition like this, but if you're gonna get it, now is the time.
No, I'm like, man, if I had gotten it now, I would have gotten better so much faster.
I'm trying to figure out time travel so I can send these videos back to myself. But
yeah.
Thank you to everyone listening and watching. Looking forward to your comments. Really appreciate hearing about your journeys as well, and hope to see you in this next really fascinating story with Sophie. She's a great woman, and yeah, it's a great one to check out.
Thanks, man.